Hey everyone, welcome back to the God Project. We got our friend Caleb Jackson here who's going to talk to us about miracle claims, including those that are medically documented. So we're very excited to have him on the show today. My name is Brian, and I am a theist, but not a Christian, considering that, kind of a questioner. And I'm joined with my good friend Pete Lash here, who will introduce himself, and then we'll have Caleb introduce himself too.
I'm Pete. Consider myself agnostic right now. And
I'm, as they already said, I'm Caleb Jackson, self-published author at the moment, hoping to be a professionally published author soon enough. I have two books. This 2019 book called Undead, which is about the resurrection of Jesus. This is an old cover. The newer cover looks better than that. But and then the other one is Searching for a Solution to Suffering, which is about theodicy and the problem of evil. So those are both on Amazon if anyone's interested. But the work I'm doing right now is on this topic on miracle claims and just the argument from miracles and looking for documentation of it. So this is a topic that I got interested in after writing the resurrection book, because the last chapter of that book very, very briefly got into this. And so I consider the book I'm working on right now a 500-page expansion of that last chapter. So it's a pretty extensive project, and I'm hoping to have it professionally published and out by hopefully mid to late next year. So
Nice.
We'll see how that goes. I'm fairly close to finish. I probably will be able to finish writing it within into fall this year, hopefully. So we'll see how that goes. But I'm really grateful to be on here. I've been on other shows and stuff. So thank you so much for Brian, Pete, for having me on. And I hope this is a good conversation. And from what I understand, I believe I'm going to do this presentation, and they're free to ask questions or interrupt as I'm doing it. And then at the end, we'll have discussion and anything that comes to mind. So, yep.
Sounds good.
All right. With that, I will share the screen. Yep. Okay. There we go. Can you all see that?
I cannot.
Yeah, I can't see that.
You cannot see it?
No. Oh, wait. Here we go. Sorry.
There we go.
I had to add the
Oh, is it good now?
presentation. Yep, we're good.
Okay, perfect. See, that's why I asked beforehand. I didn't want to just start and then have it be a black screen, because that would be kind of awkward.
Now we're still learning.
Yeah, no, you're good. Yeah. So anyway, as we said, we're going to talk about the argument for miracles. So before I go into this, one key point is that that I think is interesting is that the argument for miracles is one of the lesser discussed miracles one of the less discussed arguments with theism. If you look at, like, for example, Phil Paper surveys, the vast majority of them are on the cosmological argument, the teleological argument, even the ontological argument, the moral argument. Miracles are ranked, I believe, bottom of that. And even among those, almost all of those are discussing Hume's argument or epistemology of can we affirm miracles. Very, very few actual published things have been argued in favor or against of particular miracle claims, with the exception of the resurrection of Jesus. Give me just a second to make sure my thing is plugged in right here. Or maybe I'll just plug it down here. Hold on. I thought my laptop was charging. I guess it isn't, but I'll do that there. All right, that should be better, I think. All right, so anyway, getting into that. What is the actual argument we have? So first of all, I think we need to define what exactly a miracle is. So a miracle is usually defined as an intervention of the laws of nature by a supernatural agent. So basically, having that kind of definition, we would formulate the argument as premise one: a miracle is an event which could only occur through the intervention of God and is impossible in the absence of such interposing. Premise two: at least one miracle has occurred in history. Premise three: therefore, at least one event in history required the intervention of God to occur. Premise four: therefore, God would exist. So I think, hold on, go back to that. I think that premises, if you agree with the definition, then premises 1, 3, and 4 would not be controversial and would pretty much follow. Premise 2, I think, is definitely the most controversial one, the evidential one of, well, can we say that this has occurred, even if we could say hypothetically, this would work as an argument. So I would argue that there are good reasons to think that at least one miracle has occurred. But how do we establish this? So I think there's three things we would really have to look for. One is that we have to establish the event itself occurred, right? We would have to know that someone's not lying or just mistaken or making the story up, that something happened to base the story off of. Then we would have to establish that it could not occur given normal natural law. So we have to make sure that, well, if they did see something, could this be explained easily naturally, or do we have to incorporate something else here? And then the third rung would be, we have to then establish God as the best explanation. And so that would that circumvent, it would roll out other, it would have God as the best explanation, roll out other natural alternatives. And that's how you would get to affirmation in the divine in that sense. So this is just a slide to establish, what's the burden if we're just trying to say that at least one miracle claim is true. Well, according to 10 country survey in 2006, if you add up all the numbers, the percentages of people who've done it, just among Pentecostal Christians, over 200 million claims of miracles exist. And that's not including Catholics. That's not including non-Pentecostal Christians who've seen it. And it's not including people of other religions. So we're just looking, just that alone is 200 million. So it would probably be very close to 1 billion if you include all the other groups as well. And even among like educated people, not to say that Pentecostals aren't educated, but even in 2004, there was a survey that showed that 55% of American doctors, not doctors in third world countries, but Western doctors, American doctors, believe that they had personally witnessed a miracle. And this was defined as a healing that they thought was naturally inexplicable. And that 75% believe that miracles still happen today. Okay, so but how do we look at looking at these things and ruling out what is probably a miracle and what isn't? What would be a red flag? What's something that would help us in confirming this? Well, a couple of different things. So one, we want something that's unlikely to remit naturally, and so it's severe. So a lot of cancers can go away naturally. Stuff like having the common cold, that's not very severe. So we would need to make sure that the disease is not something that goes away easily or quickly, and that it is something that's pretty serious. So we're not looking at mild discomfort. So for example, I wouldn't really include arthritis because I don't think that would fit the criteria. And I think that those can go into remission and they're not severe enough to be easily explained by the supernatural. The healing is instantaneous and not gradual. This is probably one of the most important ones because a natural healing works with the immune system, with the human body. And so you have different pieces working together. And so because you have this and you have rates, healings, especially really severe things, happen gradually over time. So people who broke their back, they have to go to physical therapy, they have to work on it, and eventually they get better over time. With a miracle, when we read, Jesus healing people in the Bible, it's like that. And so if this happens really, really quickly, it's harder to explain that by this mechanistic explanation, by all these different parts, because we know that's not how they operate. We want a healing that's complete, not merely partial. So someone feels a little bit better, that we don't want that. We want someone who's like completely cured of the disease. Maybe having a scar left over is okay, but not something where, well, I'm still in severe pain, or I can walk a little bit better, but I still have to have a wheelchair every once in a while. Like, no, that's not gonna cut it. Permanent, not temporary. That one seems obvious. If they get better, but then get sick again of the same condition, well, that's probably not a miracle. Organic and not psychosomatic. So something that's physical and not just in their head where they think that they're healed. So not just saying, I don't feel pain anymore, but establishing that, no, that bone is really healed, that tumor is really gone, and not just perceiving it. So it's not just, I don't feel pain, but it's after establishing the disease is in fact gone. Healing can't be attributed to medicine or treatment. The medicine is shown to be inadequate, or they stop taking it. That seems pretty obvious as to why, because if this could be attributed to medicine, you wouldn't really have to posit a supernatural explanation. The healing occurs directly within a religious context. So that's kind of important because that's how we're getting to the theistic explanation in part. If they just got better without that religious context, it would maybe be an anomaly, but we wouldn't necessarily have to say it's a miracle. Although admittedly, that's pretty hard to determine because most people do pray. Surveys show most people do pray for healing of serious conditions. And so it's hard to disprove that didn't happen in a religious context. But most of the ones that I'm looking at happened like at the moment of prayer, or at the moment of visiting a shrine. So it's not just we happen to be praying and the person happened to be getting better and these kind of circumvent each other. No, these are things where there's a direct timeline in that sense. And lastly, is comparable recoveries of the disease are not observed in secular contexts. Again, establishing a secular context is difficult, but if this is something that only happens in a religious context and didn't happen in secular context, that would be better evidence that this is not something that is merely a natural remission. So we're comparing that. Will it not let me? Oh, there we go. Okay. So looking at testimony, as far as what kind of testimony we're looking for, right? No one is saying here that we should accept all miracle claims, regardless of where they come from, or all alien abduction claims, all claims of seeing Bigfoot. So what are we really looking for? So we want something that's close up. We don't want it to be really long after the facts removed, where it was second or third hand. That seems pretty fair. We don't want it to, we want it to be documented close by. So not something where well, I heard this happen in a faraway country that we can't go investigate. Something that's public, that's seen by a lot of people versus some guy by himself. So most alien abduction stories, for example, it's like 1 or 2 people at most who are taken up. You don't have like a crowd of like 100 people seeing the person float up from their bedroom into the UFO. That would be a lot better. But we don't see that with a lot of those cases. So we want it to be something that's pretty public, or at least has a good number of witnesses besides just one person. Investigated by a professional or a third party. So we don't want this to be by people who are already really prone to believe it. So people who already, so for example, if you went to India and there was followers of a guru who said they saw him perform miracles, if they're already his followers, they may not be unbiased, and it might be harder to do that. They may already be inclined to accept this without critical inquiry. And so it's interesting that most world religions have miracle claims after the religion is established, but only, I believe, of the major world religions, only Christianity, Islam, and maybe Mormonism have miracle claims at the start of the religion, where there was persecution and they got pushed back because it countered common beliefs of the time. So those are interesting. But most miracle claims in other religions come after the religion's already been long established by people who already believe it. We want events that's theologically significant, so not just something that happens randomly. So the example I give is if a unicorn suddenly appeared in the middle of Times Square, that would be very weird, but we wouldn't need to think God was behind that. Like, why would God want to make a unicorn in Times Square? Whereas it seems more reasonable to think that God would answer prayer and would want to be in a relationship with people and have that context. We don't want vague details. We want specifics. So especially with diagnoses, we want to make sure that it was accurate, who, what, when, where. And so if someone just said, like, I saw someone healed who was paralyzed, well, what condition do they had? How long were they paralyzed for? What was their name? All of this is relevant because that affects the thing. You have the phrase, the devil's in the details. So I would say that the angel is in the anonymities, as far as it's easier to justify a miracle claim when you don't have the details. And lastly, you want something that occurs in good conditions for memory. So you don't want bad lighting. You don't want it from a really far distance. You want to be with people who you already recognize. If it's a highly stressful event with a weapon, like a car accident or something, memory shown to not be very reliable there. Or if something happens slowly and repeatedly. Those are the conditions that kind of want. That would make false memory less likely. So given that, after we establish that is a possible sentiment, how do we then compare the two hypotheses as far as the miracle hypothesis versus the natural phenomenon? Once we've established that something happened and that the natural explanations aren't very good. So under the supernatural agent hypothesis, you would not necessarily expect these to be replicable because God is a free agent who can make up his decisions. And so if this was something that we could do every single time in a repeated study, and there have been repeated studies of prayer, and surprise, surprise, they get very mixed results. If this was something that could be repeated constantly, then we would assume this was some kind of unknown natural law, because we know natural laws are replicable under controlled conditions. And we know that free agents are a lot harder to replicate in that way. And so I would say that if we saw miracles happening after prayer every single time, we would almost say that it's good evidence for telekinesis. We could say that, well, maybe people get in these meditative states and that's what's causing this. And that would be a better explanation, because we at least know these people are getting the states and concentrating, and that's causing it. Whereas we don't know God's intentions, and we don't know why God sometimes does it and sometimes not. So I don't think that would even be good evidence for the supernatural. Replicability is evidence for the natural. So you want something that's a bit more random. You want superior in quality, speed, etc., because God wants to stand out among natural law. And so if this is something that looks just like a natural healing, well, if it's gradual, if it's not complete, well, that looks like any other healing we'd be familiar with. So why think that God is standing out here? Whereas if this is something that looks different than how we expect natural healings to happen, well, that would be quite different. The supernatural hypothesis can account for a much wider range of healing. So if it was only people getting healed of cancer or only people getting healed of blindness, for example, well, that might be good evidence for some kind of unknown natural law. But the issue is that we have virtually every disease you can think of, there have been miracle accounts of. And so you have to have a very wide scope to explain all of these. And so the supernatural hypothesis explains this pretty easily, because, God isn't limited, but you're going to have to posit not just one natural explanation, but a huge number of independent natural laws to explain all of these things. And the last one is, I already said instantaneous as far as supernatural versus natural, because natural is more mechanistic. So that's not surprising under the supernatural hypothesis, but it is surprising under the natural phenomenon hypothesis. And the last one is you want consistency in the account. So one noticeable thing that I saw in a lot of these reports is that a lot of times people describe at the moment of prayer where they're healed, a feeling, they'd say it's either like a fire or like electricity, and they think that's the Holy Spirit. So it usually runs through them. People who are in wheelchairs jump up because their feet are literally burning. That's a common sentiment here, is this idea of burning, where it's like a fire, where it's almost the person's in pain for a few seconds. Now, you may say that's the placebo effect, but some of these are organic conditions that can't be cured with the placebo effect. So the fact that a lot of these accounts, regardless of what condition it is, have these details makes sense that this is the same agent doing this, whereas the natural hypothesis has to take a bunch of different accounts and make it work in this like quilt-like structure. So I think the supernatural agent hypothesis in some conditions is a lot cleaner. And so on certain conditions with certain claims, we can say that it's a better explanation than the natural hypothesis. But what about David Hume's argument against miracles? This comes up all the time whenever people talk about miracle claims, as far as, will Hume address this? And Hume, in many people's eyes, debunked the idea that we can accept testimony of any miracle claim. So a lot of people have debated the exact nature of Hume's argument, but this is how I understand it, and this is how I would put it syllogistically in short. So Hume says that the regularities of natural law are firmly established and well evidenced. So we have really good evidence that the laws of nature exist. You see them every single day of your life. We observe these in laboratories. These are repeatable. Everyone can see it. It's the best kind of evidence you could have for something. Whereas the evidence for miracle claims is always problematic because people are too willing to believe that they are either really gullible in religious context, or people are too willing to lie because they want people to tithe. They want people to give them money. They want to establish a religion. If I told you Jesus walked on water, it's not just to say, oh, that's really cool. It's to say, yeah, he's God and you should accept him as your Lord and Savior and go to my church and give me money in Hume's mind. So we should always be more skeptical of religious claims, because there's always in his mind people who are either too naive to critically evaluate them, or people who are too willing to lie to people and take advantage of them for purposes of that. And people, of course, love gossip and they love sharing stories about these. And so humans just naturally love wonder. And so it's too easy to spread these stories without critically investigating them. So Hume's just saying in all the miracle accounts we have, it's always bad testimony, people who are just gullible or people who can't be trusted. We don't have enough witnesses, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to make these compete with each other. If we have to compare either the laws of nature are regular or the testimony of these people, which is very flawed, is accurate, if you weigh these together in Hume's mind, it's always going to come out in favor of regularities and not laws of nature. You're not going to have, you'd have to have testimony that would be so good that it would have to be even better than the testimony we have of the regularities of nature. You wouldn't just have to show that someone rose from the dead. You'd have to then make that rule out that anyone ever stayed dead, and good luck with that. So in his mind, it's this battle between either the laws of nature are regular or miracles happen, and you're never going to be able to beat out the idea that the laws of nature are regular. So a lot of people have criticized this. Most notably was John Ehrman, and John Ehrman notably was an agnostic. I think he's still alive. He's an agnostic philosopher of science. He's not even a Christian, but he said, yeah, Hume's methodology is really bad here, because you'd have to throw out lots of things if we took that approach. So just to give the quick problems with that people have criticized him for, first of all, the laws of nature are not prescriptive, they're descriptive. We observe them and we record them, but there's no idea that these have to cause things to happen, that it must be this way, that it couldn't conceivably be a different way. And more importantly, natural laws are always conditional on closed systems. So if you have an open system, you can always influence the results. So if I said that, if I said someone walked on water, you might think that's a miracle, but if the water's frozen, well, it's not anymore. If a virgin gave birth, well, that would be a miracle. Well, if she's artificially inseminated, it wouldn't be a miracle anymore. So we can't just make blatant statements like people never rise from the dead or people never fly. We'd have to say, apart from other conditions, if the person's being lifted up with a harness or something, then they could. But we have to say outside of all those conditions, then they can't do that. But of course, the theist isn't arguing that. The theist is saying, well, yeah, God's the condition. God is intervening in this case. And so it's not analogous to say that, because when God rose Jesus from the dead, he's acting differently than he did with other people. And so it's not a good analogy. Another one is that, we already established testimony can be reliable if we have those conditions put in place. And the scientific method is actually based around reliable testimony. So we can't go out and test every single paper that we read. Now, there is peer review, but the issue is, of course, do you trust the peer review? You didn't actually watch them you didn't watch them peer review and repeat the experiment themselves. You have them taking it. So I think we can say that the scientific method is shown to be reliable, and that it is shown that it produces good results, and that it's self-correcting when it's not reliable. And so we take the reliability of that institution and of all those witnesses and then apply it to say, although I can't check every claim they make, because I trust them in these areas and they've shown themselves to be reliable, therefore I trust them in this area in that sense. So you're taking general reliability and putting it onto that. And so that's what the miracle advocates are arguing that we're doing with testimonies like these, that we're saying, well, look, doctors as a physician are supposed to be Their job is to make decisions that are life-threatening, essentially, and to help save people's lives. And they are prone to error sometimes, but generally we trust their judgment. And so because they have that general established reliability when they make claims about people being healed or so forth, well, we should take their word on it, because unless we have positive evidence to think that they're not. And so it's a general principle we apply as far as general liability in light of positive evidence to the contrary. So if you had good evidence that they weren't, okay, that would be relevant. But if we don't have that good evidence, well, maybe not. And one example that the philosopher Timothy McGrew gives as far as applying Hume's principles to science is saying that in the early 1700s, scientists didn't believe that meteorites were a thing. There were lots of people who gave testimony to say, oh, yes, this rock flew in my yard and it was steaming and I saw the fire off of it. And they give it to the scientists later on and it looks like a regular rock. And of course, back then they couldn't test the rocks, right? So the scientists just had these testimonies, people saying, yes, we saw the rocks fall from the sky. They had signed affidavits. People swore under oath in court they saw this. And they were laughed at. And scientists said, yeah, we know this doesn't happen. All we have is these testimonies of these uneducated people saying they saw rocks fall from the sky. Even the famous physicist Laplace called them, fictions. We know of such fables. But of course, now we know meteorites really are a thing, that they do exist and they do fall to Earth sometimes. And so it was the scientists were wrong to reject the testimony of those people in that case. You could do the same thing with how people viewed zoology back in Hume's day. In Hume's time, they didn't think that platypuses existed. They didn't think that gorillas existed. They didn't think that giant squid existed. They'd heard stories about these from travelers, but they dismissed them as superstitious legends from tribesmen. But of course, we know that a lot of things actually do exist. And so this just shows that given that track record, that epistemology has been wrong many times. And so it's not the best way to evaluate claims as long as the evidence is really good. So that's just a shortened version. There's much more that could be said on that. But let's look at before we, what was that?
Are we doing like
Yeah,
questions?
no, you can interrupt.
Yeah, before I
go ahead.
move on, and just a quick question. When you say scientists were wrong for rejecting the rocks falling from the sky and platypuses existing, I don't know that that's a fair analogy, because no one's necessarily denying that the well, let's put it this way, the testimony itself is not the problem. It's the act of tying it to a supernatural cause, right? So to say that, oh, a rock fell from the sky into my yard, you're not assigning a cause to that. You're just telling your testimony. And that's really not the objection of, Hume, I guess, or atheists. It would be more the act of tying it to a cause, because you don't have an explanation for the rock falling into your yard. You're saying, oh, because I don't have an explanation for this, God did it, right? So you think that's a fair analogy to make in light of that?
Yeah, so Hume is saying that we should dismiss the stories in general together. So in that principle, so this kind of goes to the 3-tier thing I was saying earlier of establishing that the event happened, then establishing the cause and God doing it. So in this case, you're saying you would believe them if they said the rock fell from the sky, but you just would say that we can't know that it was God, right? So I guess a better analogy would be like if someone told you that they saw someone walking on water, would you believe that they really did see that, but that it wasn't a supernatural cause, that maybe it was they were walking on rocks, or maybe it was an illusion? Or would you just say, no, I don't believe that you saw that at all. I think you're either hallucinating or just lying to me. That's kind of the distinction, right? As far as I can agree with you that argument itself does not get you to a supernatural cause. That's what I was saying earlier with comparing it. That's a different argument. But this is just the idea of, should we always dismiss the testimony of someone in these cases, or should we grant it but say, if you grant it and say I don't know, that's different than saying no, it didn't happen at all. So that's I think the difference there. That's more what I was saying. So
yeah, okay, that's fair.
Yeah, no, so that's fair. Yeah. So this last thing before we get to the documented cases is this what I call retroactive historiography. So it's common in New Testament scholarship. In fact, this actually was on your last show, or one of your later shows with
I know those guys.
Greg. Yeah. When Greg was, I noticed this when he was discussing the historicity of Acts. One of his criteria was saying that Acts is not a good source because there's no critical examination and there's too much incredulity. And he gives examples of all these miracle claims. And so this is why Acts couldn't be written by a reliable historian, because, well, he has miracle claims and people don't still have miracle claims. These have to be late legends. These couldn't come from eyewitnesses or couldn't come from people who sincerely believe them. And I think that's just demonstrably wrong. And that's what Craig Keener's, there we go, giant 2-volume work on that is to going to show where he has thousands of cases of people in the modern day saying that they see miracles. And so that doesn't sound controversial to say that people today still think they see miracles, but people apply that to New Testament studies and say that, well, Jesus couldn't have originally walked on water or healed blind people. These have to be late legends. I mean, but the idea is, well, no, people could sincerely believe that he did. Now, you don't have to say that he did it supernaturally, but people could think it and be wrong. And maybe it was faith healing. Maybe it was a placebo effect. We can debate that. But that doesn't mean we should dismiss the account itself as a legend. So here's just a list of all the conditions Jesus healed in his ministry, among others. And I think what's interesting is you can find modern parallels to all of these claims in other contexts. So there are firsthand witnesses to all these, at least claiming that they saw this. You don't have to believe them, but this just shows that it doesn't necessitate later legends for this to be an explanation. You can say people at the time really did think Jesus did this, and there might be some other explanation. And you can make parallels like I have a couple examples here. So in Acts, it talks about Paul being blind, and when he's healed, it has this weird description of scales falling from his eyes. We have a modern example of that with Blaisetz Kazanavi, I think. I probably butchered that. Who is a woman who was healed at the Lourdes shrine, which we'll get to, of blindness. And she had, I believe it was like chronic conjunctivitis or something, where your eyes swell up and it causes vision impairment and irritation, and it causes skin cells to like clump together where it looks almost like scales. And so when she was healed of this, they fell from her eyes. And so you have interesting parallels with those like medical descriptions with, oh, that matches what Paul is. So I wonder if this is just an eyewitness reporting what they saw, and there could be some historical core to this. Josephus, in the Jewish historian, talks about this giant light appearing on top of a temple right before the war, and people thought this was Yahweh. And we have examples of that with the Virgin Mary down here in Zaytun, Egypt in the 1960s, where this giant light figure appeared on top of this church, this Orthodox church, or this Coptic church in Egypt, multiple times for over 3 years, and people thought this was the Virgin Mary. And so, maybe Josephus is right. This really happened, and we just don't know the explanation. Matthew talks about, the saints rising from the dead and walking and being seen by many people. A lot of people say, well, we should expect more accounts of that. But we have lots of other ancient examples, even more modern examples of people where we have one source saying, yes, a lot of people thought they saw ghosts walking around the city and stuff like this. And so, yeah, it's possible people really did think that. And same with the transfiguration of Jesus. You could compare that to Bernadette, who was a 14-year-old girl at Lourdes, who claimed that she saw the Virgin Mary appeared to her, and witnesses said that her face lit up like transfigured, which is what we have for Jesus. So we can be virtually certain that witnesses really reported these things in modern contexts. And so the argument is if witnesses reported these things firsthand in modern context, is it really that much of a stretch to think weird stuff happens today? Weird stuff probably happened back then, especially when they didn't have as much scientific advancement. So point of this being, we don't have to dismiss these as legends. We can say that these are based on some kind of historical core that we need to explain. All right, so let's now get to documenting miracle claims. So I'm just picking some of these at random. I have quite a few of these on here, and I usually try to take a medical examination of these. So for one example, this was one in, I forget where in Africa this was, but in September 2019, a woman named Patricia Kanyamala, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, gave birth to a child, but the child had a genu recurvatum, which you can see in the bottom left picture here, causes it's a muscle atrophy, not atrophy, it's a muscle dysfunction where the kneecap isn't fully developed, and so the foot is clubbed and bent backwards, with the knee not being fully developed. And this is usually treated with a cast or with surgery. So usually you would have to put this in a cast for several months, and then eventually the leg and the bone would grow into it, and it would become straightened over time, or you'd have to get it surgically done. And the family couldn't afford either of these. And so the next day, they had a prayer chain with a bunch of their pastors praying for this for God to heal the baby. And then on the 11th, the day after that, the foot was completely straightened, and it's been straightened ever since. And this was backed up by a Zimbabwean surgeon as well who looked into this. Another example is Dwayne Miller. Now, this is also one that's on, it's actually on video. You can look it up on YouTube. It's a bit well known. So Dwayne Miller lost his voice in the early 1990s because he had a pretty bad case of the flu. And when he had seen over 60 doctors, but what had happened was his vocal cords had become paralyzed and scarred and damaged from that thing. That I think it was the erosion of the myelin sheath was the official diagnosis when they did scans of his throat. And so he talked in a really, really hoarse, raspy voice and could barely get above a whisper. And so he was a pastor, and so he did take a break for a year because he could barely speak. And so he became really depressed, and doctors told him, yeah, you're going to lose your voice entirely in probably about a year. And Dwayne's like, well, I'm a pastor. That's my whole job. And so he became depressed. 2 days before his healing, he actually had a shotgun in his mouth and was attempting suicide, but he talked himself out of it and felt like God had something better for him. So 2 days after that, on January 17th, 1993, he was asked to do a sermon because the pastor who took his place was out of town. And so they said, well, Dwayne, and we know that your voice is really sore and that's going to be hard for you, but could you please do this? And Dwayne was like, you know what, if I'm going to lose my voice in 18 months or so, I want to at least go out, preaching. And so I'm going to use the rest of what I have to do it. And so the audio of the sermon is online and he's preaching it. And ironically enough, it was on a sermon. I forget the exact passage in Psalms, but it was about God healing people. And so Dwayne was in the sermon is saying, God heals us spiritually and he can heal us physically, but sometimes he doesn't. And we have to accept that and accept his providence. And he's like, God hasn't healed me, but we have to continue to worship him in these times of trial. And as he's saying those words, his voice becomes normal again. You can hear it on the audio and he freezes there and isn't sure what's happening. Then he starts crying out of joy and then his voice is gone and everyone in the audience is like surprised by this. And he goes back to the doctor and his voice is, the scar tissue is completely gone. The myelin sheath is back. The vocal cord is no longer paralyzed. And his voice retained that way for 30 years, up until the present day. There's videos of him online from just, a year or two ago talking with a completely normal voice now. So this is one that's actually on film. It's instantaneous. It's medically documented. Really interesting story. Another section that I talk about in the book is about, I call them veridical Christic encounters. And so these are things where people have visions of Jesus, in the present day, where he appears to them. And I'm not just doing persons who think they see Jesus and that's it, because I would say those could be hallucinations. So we're looking specifically for things that have veridical elements. So things where they get information that they didn't know, things where multiple people see him at a time, or they touch him, or there's a healing. Those are the ones I'm mostly concerned with. And sometimes you get a combination of those. So one example of many is Betty Baxter, who's pictured right here. She was born with a severe case of congenital scoliosis. So her spine was really twisted and she was bedbound and paralyzed for most of her life. And doctors, her dad didn't want her to undergo surgery because it was considered too risky. And so she was stuck like that. And so in 1941, Betty and her mother both said that they saw a vision of Jesus appear to her and say that she was going to be healed on August 24th of that year. And so they got excited. So her mom goes out and buys her a new dress and buys her slippers. And sure enough, on August 24th, they have a crowd of their neighbors gather around and they see their mom lay their hands on Betty and pray for her. And at this point, Betty's head is basically in her lap because she can't really stand up straight. And they pray for her. And as she's running her hands along the back, you can literally hear the popping of it. And she stands up and walks around. And the neighbors are amazed by this. And she goes and is seen by many. And so there's actually a local newspaper who heard about this. And they go and they interviewed all the witnesses. And they interviewed Betty. Then they went to her doctor and interviewed it and wanted to see the x-rays and all that stuff. So this is a pretty well-documented case of someone claiming to see Jesus appear to them, healing them of a condition that was medically verified. I'm actually working with a physician named Dr. Joe Bergeron, and he's a specialist in like rehabilitation and paralysis here in Indianapolis. And he got to meet Betty Baxter long after her healing while she was an adult. And he came up with the diagnosis when he reviewed her medical documentation and looked at that. So you get really interesting cases of things like that. But, this is just a slide of journal publications. I won't go through all of these, but if you're curious of any like case studies of these, this one on the right is a case from the documentary Sin Proof. I know that Brian said that he's seen that, of Christopher Gunderson, who is a 16-year-old boy who had stomach tubes because he couldn't properly eat food orally. He'd had to have it all pumped into his stomach because he had chronic gastroparesis for 16 years since birth. And so he was prayed for, and he was instantly that night able to eat for the first time through his mouth with no adverse things happening. And a few months later, the doctors were able to remove the tubes because he showed no symptoms of it. And so that's a case of it. And that condition, it can go away after a few years, but there's no documented case of it going away after 16 years. Usually after that much time, it's considered permanent. And it was instantaneous at the moment of healing the same day as well. So those are all relevant things to look at. But does God heal amputees, right? We have these other more vague conditions, but do we have any examples of God growing limbs back? Well, first of all, there are some cases of God growing organs back, which is, equally as impressive. You can look at Bruce Van Notta's case where a surgically removed testin grew back partially after prayer. You can look at this Pentecostal magazine here is talking about Gene Mullinex, who in 1958 had a right lung and 3 ribs removed from a cyst that he was coughing up blood. And so he went to a Pentecostal revival, and was prayed for, and he claimed that the hole in his side instantly closed, and that when they did the x-rays, which is what's pictured here, that you can now see he has a full set of lungs again. And one of his ribs was a little bit scrawnier, which he said is proof that it was actually removed in the first place. And so he brought back the MRI. And Dr. Joe Bergeron, who I mentioned earlier, also met Gene and was able to and he told me that the x-ray is consistent with what Gene was describing in terms of that. And here we have a restored brain after hemispherectomy. This is of an Asian man named Tony Lowe, who had cancer, and he had brain tumors and cancer in his head. So they had to remove about a quarter of it. They actually removed more than this. This was taken before his second surgery. So about a quarter of his brain had been removed, but he'd had a near-death experience of Jesus. He was a Buddhist at the time. But eventually he converted to Christianity because of that. And when they went back to the doctor 5 years later in 2013, his brain had restored, which is not, as far as we know, biologically possible. His doctor thought the cancer had come back. And so they did another scan, and it showed that, nope, the cancer wasn't there. That was actually his brain. So those are kind of cases analogous to amputees being healed. But there actually is one case in history of an amputee allegedly being healed in the 17th century. But it's very well documented. To put a long story short, I have a whole video on this on YouTube, and I also have a very long a chapter where I talk about this for like 20 pages. But there was a Spanish man by the name of Miguel Picer. He'd injured his right leg in a farming accident in 1637. He went to a hospital and got it amputated, and they buried the leg in the courtyard as was usual. He then went and got a permit to become a beggar in front of the cathedral in Zaragoza, Spain. And he was there as a beggar for 2 years, and he would routinely take the oil from the lamps and rub it on his leg and cry out to the Virgin Mary, in mercy and stuff like that. So 2 years later, he goes back home to Calanda in his parents' house for about 2 weeks. And while he's there, he says one night that he's not feeling well, and his mom sees that there's a crust over the stump of his leg, which is unusual. So later she goes up to his room and sees him sleeping, and she sees that there's 2 legs sticking out now. And she says, "Oh my God, Miguel, you have 2 legs again. It's a miracle." So this quickly spreads throughout the town. 3 days after this, the earliest document we have is 3 days later, which is pretty early for ancient history, or not ancient history, for modern history. One of the local bishops hears about this and gets involved. So he goes and gets an affidavit from 10 witnesses. Then the archbishop 2 months later wants a full-on investigation where they get 24 witnesses. And these witnesses included people who had seen Miguel as a beggar, includes his family who knew that he had been amputated, includes the doctors, the surgeons who had cut the leg off in the first place. They asked them, like, is this the same man you amputated? Did you actually cut off the leg? The doctor said that they did, and they cared for the leg for several months. They had to put hot iron on it to stop it from bleeding, and he got routinely cared for by them for several months at the hospital. They went to the spot where the leg had been buried and in the hospital courtyard, and there was nothing there when they dug it up. It was just the empty box. And the leg on his foot was had the same birthmarks and scars as his other leg, but this time it had a full-on circular kind of scar from where it had been, the saw had been from the amputation. So this was eventually declared a miracle, and there were lots of witnesses to it, including Protestants who very much hated the Catholics at the time. And David Hume, in his essay, even mentions it. To put the short version, he says, "Look, this miracle was of so singular of a nature as to could scarcely admit of a counterfeit, and the witnesses very numerous. We had several dozen at least, all of them in a manner spectators of the fact to which they gave their testimony." But he says, "But look, one of the cardinals here who reports this in one of his journals seems a little bit suspicious about this," which isn't true, by the way. Hume is misreading him there, but nonetheless, he applauds and says, "You know what? It's good that he was suspicious and that he didn't investigate it." And Hume says here that you don't even need to investigate this. We can hand wave it away. He says, "He therefore concludes, like a just reasoner, that such evidence carried falsehood upon the very face of it, and that a miracle supported by any human testimony was more properly a subject of derision than of argument." And so, and elsewhere he says up here, he considered justly that it was not requisite, in order to reject a fact of this nature, to be able to accurately disprove the testimony and trace its falsehood. He knew that it was commonly altogether impossible for such a distance of time and place. And so Hume is saying, look, there's no way this guy could ever disprove that this happened, but he doesn't need to disprove it. He can dismiss this and dismiss all these witnesses because we know this can't happen. And so it's more likely that there's something up, even if we can't give positive evidence against it. So Hume is saying that we don't really need to even look into these, and we should just dismiss them because we know that it's more likely that someone's lying or that they're all gullible or something. Last thing I'll talk about here that kind of goes into that with the amputee case is how the Catholic Church investigates miracles. Now, I'm not personally Catholic. I am Protestant, but I think there's a lot to be commended here in that Protestants don't have an official way to look into these. Most of these are just accounts from Pentecostals. But the Catholic Church is a lot more organized and structured, and so they have a whole system to how to look at these. So one good source for this is Dr. Jacqueline Duffin's book, Medical Miracles. Now, Duffin is an atheist, actually, and she documents a lot of these. But what's interesting about her story is that in the 1980s, she's a hematologist. She was given a set of scans of a cancer patient with leukemia, and she at first thought it was from a lawsuit. The woman had leukemia, which remitted, but then came back, and usually after a single remission, that's not a good sign. And so chemotherapy had not worked, and she was expected to die. So Dr. Duffin thought this was for a lawsuit, and that certainly this patient's probably dead because as advanced as this cancer is, it's unlikely they would survive. But then when she looked at the other scans, the cancer had instantly gone away, and she was surprised by this. And she was like, what is this, a miracle? And the person responded, yes, it is. And then they explained to her that the Vatican was actually asking Dr. Duffin to look into this and to get her medical opinion as to whether there was a natural explanation. And Dr. Duffin was like, well, I'm an atheist. I can't comment on it theologically. And they said, well, that's fine. We don't care what your religious affiliation is, or if you don't have one. All we care about is your medical opinion and the facts of the case. And so she went there and testified as saying, yes, as a doctor, there is no medical explanation for this. That's all I can say. And so she became interested in this topic, and the Vatican actually let her look at most of their healing cases from, I believe, like 1500 to the modern day. And that's what she talked about in this book. So the process to become a saint actually is a long one. So if let's say that Brian becomes a Catholic and lives a virtuous life as a priest and dedicated to the faith, becomes a missionary somewhere, and he dies, and someone says, Brian really should become a saint. He was such a good Catholic, great guy. And so first, the Vatican would review the biographies of your life and would interview witnesses to make sure that you were, in fact, a good person, that you weren't, a priest that was caught in a scandal or doing abusive things. And once you pass that process, you're considered venerable. That's the term, venerable. Now, to be beatified, to actually become a saint, the next step is that you have to have at least 2 miracles. It used to be 4, they lowered it to 2, in which someone has to pray on your behalf after you're dead and have a miracle happen and it be medically inexplicable. So usually you have at least 2 of these. So one example of this, Maureen Deegan, I think is how you pronounce her name, was a woman in the 1980s who had lymphedema. Now, this isn't her. The bottom picture is not her. The top one is. Lymphedema causes very severe swelling in the leg. So this was after one of her surgeries. They had to cut all of this fat off, but it kept growing back. There's no cure for it. And so eventually they actually amputated her leg up above the knee because it had gotten that bad. And this was late 1960s, early 1970s. But then her left leg started getting really bad, and was also going to require an amputation that was scheduled. It had also swelled up. So she'd been dealing with this condition for well over 10 years. And so before the amputation, her husband said, well, I want to go visit the tomb of Maria Faustina in Poland. And Faustina was a Polish nun who was famous for painting the mercy, I think the Divine Mercy image. It's the picture of Jesus, like with the heart and like the blue and red lights. You probably have seen it before. Pretty famous Catholic image. That this nun had painted this, and they had seen a biography of her life and were like really interested in her. So they wanted to go to her grave and see all the stuff like in her life in Poland. So they put aside the amputation to say, okay, Maureen's in really bad health, her leg, but you can go. And so on March 23rd, 1981, they go there. And Maureen was very cynical and was really mad at God because she'd have to go through all of this, and she was in a lot of pain. And she's like, why are we paying this much money to fly out here when I'm sick? So while she's praying, she thinks that she hears, Maria from beyond the grave saying, if you want to pray for something, Maureen, ask me for it. And Maureen just kind of in her mind says, well, if you're going to do something, do it now. And she feels this heat in her leg, and she can feel the fat starting to roll away. But she doesn't look down. She's like, nope, I'm going to go hysterical. It's just in my head. I'm not going to look at my leg. And so she didn't want to make a scene. So she doesn't look at her leg all the way till they get to the hotel room. But when she gets to the hotel room, she finally looks down and sees that her leg is normal size again, and that all this fat had just melted away within a few hours. And so she thought she was going to be locked away, but she's like, I'm just having a mental episode. They're going to put me away for thinking this. But she wakes up the next day and she's like, oh my gosh. She tells her husband, like, oh my gosh, Bob, my leg is still healed. And it stayed that way. And what's really interesting is that she actually wasn't even able to fit into her orthopedic shoes. So she'd had oversized shoes for the trip because she couldn't fit in the normal shoes. And she had to literally stuff them on the way back because they wouldn't even fit on her because her leg was now normal size. And so when they got back to America, word got around to the bishop. And so the Vatican called for 5 doctors to look at her medical records. to review it and to examine her leg. And so obviously the second amputation was canceled, and they eventually declared this medically inexplicable. And this would go on to help Maria become a saint. And so she's now canonized partially because of this miracle. So that's one example of how this process works. The last thing about Catholicism I'll say is that's notable is the Lourdes Shrine. So it's a very famous Catholic pilgrimage site because in 1858, a young girl named Bernadette in France claimed that she saw the Virgin Mary appear to her on multiple occasions, and big crowds would gather and see her praying to the Virgin Mary. They didn't see Mary herself, but the girl, said that she was talking with her and all this stuff. But one of the things that the Virgin Mary allegedly told her was that there was this grotto that could heal people. And so since 1858, people go there every year to get healed at Lourdes because they believe the water is holy and blessed by the Virgin Mary and all that stuff. And so because so many people go there, they actually have a medical bureau set up there, made up about 30 doctors or so. And the doctors don't have to be Catholic. They can be Protestant, atheist, whatever. They just have to be qualified. And so people go there. And since 1858, there's been 70 officially certified miracles, and 2,500 other ones have been impressive in their words, which is actually a pretty small amount compared to the thousands of people that go there every year. That's, far less than 1%. But they have a whole process. So they require that the miracle is instantaneous, that it's incurable, that you have to have medical documentation of the disease. And so if you go up to them and like, oh, I was healed of this, and you can't prove that you were originally sick, it's thrown out. They have this whole process. So then you have to be checked up a year after you claimed you were healed, and they wait at least 10 years before they make a decision to make sure that you still stay healed and that it doesn't come back. And so there's been up to 70 ones as of this one. The most recent one was in 2018 of a nun who was in a wheelchair for 40 years from, I think, like a pinched nerve in her back. And she'd been on morphine and had to have like a boot. And she was instantly able to walk after going to Lourdes. And she walked, I believe, over a mile the day after her healing, despite, she should have had muscle atrophy and stuff. So cases like that. Just among different ones of Lourdes that have been documented. Instantaneous healing of paraplegic and quadriplegics. That's John Trainer up here, who had been injured in World War I. He'd actually been on permanent disability and was in a nursing home because his right arm had been completely paralyzed. His legs were paralyzed and he had seizures. After going to Lourdes, the very next day, he was able to run and get out of his chair, and he actually outran the staff who was trying to chase him down because he was being hysterical. So all the muscle atrophy and stuff instantly came back. The nerves were reconnected. The immediate disappearance of facial sores and disfigurements, I'll talk about that one on the next slide. Instantaneous closing of wounds and ulcers. And in one case, which is over here, of Pierre de Roudet, it's the expedient repair of a broken leg within a few minutes. So Pierre claims that, we know that he'd had a broken leg from 8 years prior from an accident, and we have his doctor's testimony in the medical records from that. This was like in 1867. But he went to a replica of a Lourdes shrine, and he claims that the bones instantly connected, the skin grew there, and the muscles formed over it within a matter of minutes. And there's a signed affidavit from 2 witnesses who say that 2 days before they saw the bones sticking out of his leg, and that it clearly was broken. And there's some debate as people throwing away those testimonies and saying, well, Pierre could be faking it to get back like off of a pension or something. It's very complicated. I don't have time to go over it here, but it is an interesting case nonetheless. His bone legs are actually still displayed at Lourdes if you visit. And another interesting about Lourdes is that there were lots of skeptics there who were convinced, or at least documented some of these. So Alexis Carrel, who would go on to win the Nobel Prize for, I believe, chemistry, or maybe it was biology or neurology or something like that. He was on a train to Lourdes, and he saw a girl who was dying instantly get healed in the grotto. And he was convinced of this, and he actually got attacked by the scientific community, who were like saying, no, you shouldn't take this stuff seriously and stuff. And so he had to move to America to practice medicine. And the most famous critic of Lourdes was Émile Zola, who is pictured here. And Zola wrote a novel about Lourdes, but he was interesting because when he went to Lourdes in, I believe, 1890 or 1891, he got lucky to see 3 different healings. And that's pretty rare because there's only, an officialized declared healing once every few decades. And those 3 healings are the only time in history where it's happened all in one weekend. And of course, Émile Zola was there to see that. And so like one of the more notable ones of those was a woman named Marie who had facial ulcers that were eating away. So she didn't have much of a lip. The cartilage was gone. She had these huge spots where just her flesh was being eaten away by ulcers and lupus from tuberculosis. And Zola said that she didn't even look like a human, like she was barely recognizable as a woman, and that she had to wear a veil over her face because she was, just so ugly. And so we had her medical documentation a week before she went to Lourdes of her doctor saying, yeah, she's in a really poor state. Her face is eaten away. There was a doctor at Lourdes before she was healed who said that he saw her with facial scars. But Zola even testifies that after she went in the water and came back up, all of those cuts and stuff were filled with either scars or with pink skin over it and healed within a few days. And so Zola doesn't deny that this happened, but he said, well, maybe this was psychosomatic. Maybe this was some kind of placebo, which the doctors we know now is not possible. But the point is that these were recorded by cynics and skeptics, and nobody denies that people really were recovering remarkably from diseases at this shrine, even if they didn't grant the possibility. So with that, I will wrap it up to say that I'm proposing that there are many well-documented events that occur in religious contexts that allude at natural explanation, that theistic explanations, in some cases at least, have better explanatory power than naturalistic explanations. Therefore, some of these cases are probably the result of theistic inference. Therefore, God probably exists based on the argument for miracles. And so with that, I will conclude the presentation, and I guess we're going to questions now.
Nice job.
Yeah, good job.
Thank you.
It's good. Well, I had a first question if you don't want to jump in.
Go for it.
One of your first slides, it talked about the how we would want miracles to be somewhat vague.
No, we would not.
I don't remember your exact terminology.
We would not want them to be vague. I'm sorry. I don't know if I said that right. We want details because if it's vague, there could be things that are being left out. So
no. It was actually, you had written it down on the slide. We would want it to be, I forget exactly how you worded it. I should have wrote it down, but we would want it to be not necessarily like repeatable, like in a lab.
Well, that's true. Yeah, I wouldn't call that vague, but yes.
I guess my question to that would be like, if we look at the Gospels, if we look at what Jesus actually says his followers will be able to do once he leaves, right, in the ascension, basically he's telling them, hey, if you want to have this mountain moved and you ask, it'll be moved. And also in Mark, in that controversial last chapter of Mark, it talks about, hey, you're going to be able to, stomp on snakes and, heal the sick and do all these things. And he's not just talking about, specific people. He's talking about believers in general, right? So if these kinds of things happen, like you said, with the Lourdes, I think it's Lourdes,
yeah.
event, like if these kinds of things happen once every few decades, and Jesus is specifically saying, hey, this is going to be applicable to everyone. Like, I guess, how would you reconcile that? How would you make sense of that?
Yeah, well, first of all, the Mark passage that's not authentic to the original text, but I know a lot of Pentecostals still use it. But I don't think that you can read it as Jesus is saying everyone does this, because if you read Paul, he says people have specific gifts. So some people have the gift of healing, some people have the gift of joy, or of generosity, some people have the gift of teaching. It just depends. So I don't think you can take Paul's words and say that everyone has the ability to do this. I think Jesus is talking to the apostles specifically. It's how cessationists would take to say, well, he just means the disciples. He doesn't mean that every Christian out after him can do this. And even with the disciples, there are cases in the New Testament where it seems that they seem to not be able to do certain things. Like in Acts, James is beheaded by King Herod, and they don't even attempt to raise him back from the dead, even though they raise other people from the dead. And Paul talks about how he has a thorn in his flesh that he prays for God to remove 3 different times, and God says, no, like you're gonna have to deal with it. So there are cases in which prayer isn't answered, right? So I don't think you can, I would be very hesitant to establish a theology based off of that. So I don't think we can know who could be prayed for or when. I just think we should investigate when people claim that has happened. So
right, and I guess that's my question is more like, with regards to the replicability of it, I guess is the right word. Like if Jesus says, if you pray, in his will or whatever, and that will be answered, right? This mountain will be moved. That kind of sounds like something that could be replicable.
He says it to the disciples.
You could go to someone and say, hey, who's making miracle claims, would be like, let's replicate this in some way, right?
Right. He says that to the disciples. I don't know if that's meant to apply to every single Christian. So I think that's the difference. But even then, as I said, there are examples in which that doesn't happen even in the Bible. So I think that he's speaking more in that sense. And of course, Jesus was able to do miracles, but when the Pharisees pressed him on it, he was like, well, only a wicked generation asked for signs. But I don't know. I've thought about this, and I think that I think that even if it was repeatable, that wouldn't be good evidence for a supernatural agent, because we know that natural laws are repeatable. We know that agents typically are harder to replicate. So we would say this is some unknown, perhaps psychological state that could cause this to happen. Maybe when you reach a state of prayer meditation, the atoms in your brain can affect reality. There are Eastern people who believe that, at least. So, I don't know if I think it'd be good evidence for telekinesis maybe, but I just don't know if that would even be sufficient. And I think that even theologically, there's lots of places in the Bible where, it says, where even Jesus scolds Thomas for saying, blessed he who does not see, and that he was scolding Thomas for not believing the testimony of the disciples. And so I think there's a lot to say that I think a lot of the reasons that people I don't mean like everyone, so I don't want to lump everyone in this, but at least in the context that we see with in the New Testament, the women see Jesus and they're not believed because they're women, and back then women were considered to be illiterate and, for lack of a better word, stupid and gullible. And so I think Jesus, by having people trust their testimony, is trying to overcome the social prejudices of the time. Hume even says that with Hume gets criticized because in part of his essay, he says that only ignorant and barbarous nations report miracles. And based on Hume's other writings, where he basically he explicitly endorses slavery and says that white nations are the only ones who accomplish anything. Hume's basically saying only non-white people who are savages see miracles, and we as educated Englishmen know these things don't happen. So I think there are prejudices that we have with testimonies like that, and I think that still stems today, and not as explicitly, but I think that's partially why God might want us to work together and try to look at these things and listen to people's testimonies rather than just demanding to see it for ourselves, because that just shows that we don't trust certain people. And again, it doesn't mean we should trust everything. We should be cautiously avoiding it, but not so much where we just where it affects our views to say that people are. That we just say, oh yes, women or black people or whatever are superstitious, because I think those are just terrible prejudices that that God wants us to overcome, and that still have those stigmas.
Sure. Yeah. I agree that, I've read one of Hume's books at least, and, his approach isn't great. I agree with you there, but what you were saying earlier with regards to persons, like individuals, aren't necessarily replicable. I'm not sure. I guess I would question that, because it's like, especially someone like God, who's not changing, who he even says, like, I am who I am from the Alpha, the Omega, right? He's never changing, right? So I guess I would question that premise of like, oh, well, since this is an entity that, is a person, it's not a scientific method, it's not as rigid, and it's not as, we wouldn't expect replicability, right? You see what I'm saying? Sorry.
Yeah, I do. When I said that, I was referring, like, if you look in the social sciences, like psychology or sociology, there's actually the term replicability crisis, because it's so hard to replicate studies with people, like making decisions, because people make different decisions, and people are very complex people. So it's harder to replicate what a person would do in a situation than it is to, say, replicate gravity or replicate a chemistry experiment, right? There's just a lot more factors that are going on there. So I'm just saying, if we have difficulty replicating people who we can interview and know their intentions, how much harder would it be to do that for an agent who is omniscient and we might not know their intentions? Even if they are not changing and stuff, I don't think that we can say with confidence exactly what God would do every time. And if the hypothesis is that God answers prayer every time, that's very easily falsifiable, because clearly we live in a world in which there's lots of death and destruction. People pray and don't get stuff answered for. How many people prayed for their coronavirus to go away, right?
Right. And I guess I would say that's not really evidence for anything, except for maybe evidence against.
It might be, or it's at least evidence that God doesn't answer all prayers, right? But I don't think the Bible ever says that. I don't think that most theists would seriously argue that.
Sure.
So that would disprove. So if you're believing a God who answers all prayers regardless, then yes, that would falsify that. But if you believe in a God who, on rare occasions, answers prayers because he wants us to, I don't know, go through the struggles of life to become morally better, or whatever your theodicy is, then that might be a bit more specified. So That'd be a little bit harder to falsify. But, you know, again, the hypothesis that I was putting forward today was not that God always answers prayer. All I was saying is that there are some cases in which it seems God did, and that's the appeal to it, or at least some cases in which a theistic explanation seems the best explanation for this given event. And so that's what I'm appealing to. So the argument for miracles doesn't require that God always does it. It does it under a certain condition. It just requires that he has at some point done it in history.
Yeah. No, I get that.
Brian, do you have anything?
Yeah, I just had a question on one of the examples you gave, Maureen Deegan.
Yeah.
You mentioned that I think it was her husband. She shared that her leg had been healed with her husband the following day. So does that mean that no one noticed, like, at the moment of healing?
Yeah.
Yeah, I believe, I don't remember if she was wearing like longer pants or like, I don't know the conditions of that. She felt it at the moment, and she said she didn't want to make a scene because she was like, oh, if she sees her legs healed. So she didn't even look down until after they got back to the hotel room. And at that point, I believe they had both seen it, but she was like, I just got to shake this off. And then in the morning, when it was still there, is when her and her husband were discussing it, and they were like, oh wow, this really happened. So her husband was a lot more devout of a Catholic than she was. She was devout, but after she'd been going through all that for a decade, she had self-admittedly kind of lost her faith and was really mad at God. And so that kind of brought her back. But yeah, she said that the healing was basically instant, and that although she didn't see it until they got back to the room, she could clearly feel it, and her foot was slipping out of her shoe, and that's why she had to stuff it, because she literally couldn't fit into it later on. So yeah, that's, I believe, as far as I know, I'd have to go back and look at it, but that's as far as what I can remember how that goes. And this is, you know, she'd had this condition for probably 10 or 12 years prior to that. So I think you can at best say, even if we don't know even if we're not sure of the details that night, we can at least say that she was healed overnight. Even if we were to say maybe she wasn't healed that night, even though she says she was, but at best that's still remission within a few hours versus, you know, with a condition that she's had for a decade. So wasn't a gradual thing that happened over several weeks or something like that.
Yeah, I one more question on the Catholic. I never knew this. I don't know if I'm going to repeat this correctly, but correct me if I'm wrong. But from what I heard you say, in order for someone to become a saint, there has to be one documented miracle or two.
Two. It used to be 4. Now I believe it's 2. And they make exceptions to that sometimes, but that's the general rule that's laid out by the Vatican. Yeah.
Do you think that in any way adds to the incentive to people to have miracles documented in any way?
Add to the incentive to have miracles documented. You mean like people to report it, or do you mean for the Vatican to confirm it?
So does that add to the possibility that people are looking for things to possibly document as miracles?
Like they want that person to become a saint?
Yeah, it adds incentive, whereas maybe like in Protestantism you don't have that, right? So there's no at least that incentive is not there, right?
Yeah, that's a fair point. So yeah, I would say that it does in that point, but they're not the ones going around looking for it. Usually someone reports it to them, and then they call for an investigation. So they don't usually go out. It's like, okay, if anyone has this, like we're interviewing people saying, have you been healed by Saint so and so? Have you been healed by Saint so and so? So usually they get the report, they investigate it, and then from that it gets added on. So these usually canonization of miracles of saints takes decades at least. So the whole process of making them venerable, you had a good life, that takes years just to get all the documents and look at it. Then this process of affirming the miracle and stuff takes several years. So it's a very slow process. But that's, why I guess, yeah, it's possible some people who might want them to be a saint could be slightly dishonest, which is why we have to look at we have to have doctors review it and make sure we can look at the medical records and confirm that they really were sick with this condition and are no longer. So
yeah.
In that sense, of course, they have to, if they have like a really sketchy background or something like criminal history, that would be applicable too. So they have to look at the credibility of the witnesses, look at the medical documentation. That's why it takes so long. So it's not like we looked at it one day and you're a saint. It's a very long process.
Yeah, I get it.
Yeah. So yeah. Well, if that's all, thank you guys for having me. And
I did have one more question that I just thought of. Are there any interesting miracle claims or I guess they would be described as miracle claims that aren't apparently theologically significant, but to you there's like it fits the other criteria, like there's a great number of witnesses, there's
secular context, maybe.
Yeah.
That's a
anything
good
more
question. That's a
compelling?
good question. The closest thing I could think of would be like maybe like claims of like UFOs or something, or like I don't know, like maybe I'm thinking of like spontaneous combustion claims, right? Of people like bursting into flames mysteriously, just out of the blue. And I know those are probably, I think a lot of those have been debunked, so I haven't read enough into it to like believe them. But that's the first thing that comes to mind. There actually was one that it was in a religious context, but okay, let me just explain what it was. So it was a Catholic priest in the 1600s, Joseph Cupertino, who was well known to levitate. In fact, he's actually the patron saint of astronauts and pilots, which is kind of funny. But he would regularly levitate, and this was seen. I believe, when they were doing his canonization, they had about over 150 witnesses in different contexts, inside, outside. And I don't just mean levitate like David Blaine a few inches off the ground. We're talking like 30 feet off the ground, unaided, hanging in the air for like 30 minutes at a time. And usually he was in a trance-like state, but this didn't always happen in religious context. Sometimes when he was just listening to music, he would do this. So sometimes it happened in religious context, sometimes it didn't. The Vatican tried to hide him away from people because it would distract them during Mass, understandably, because he would just start lifting up while they were praying. And so, but he would do this in other contexts. And so when they canonized him, they didn't even use that miracle. They used, I think, some healing miracles that he did, but they didn't even count that precisely because he didn't just do it in a religious context. So that's the closest thing I can think of, which is really interesting, where I'm like, I don't know what happened. There's actually I think he's from Yale. I have a quote from a Yale historian who is like, we have like literally, we can't say that Joseph levitated, but we can at least have to ask historically why hundreds of people thought that he did. And so we have to explain that. So it's like incontrovertible that many witnesses attested to this. And so trying to explain that, we could look at it and done it. Dale Allison actually Dale Allison's a New Testament scholar he's a pretty liberal Christian, but he does this analogy as well, where he's saying like it's hard to do natural causes, and he actually thinks if Joseph levitated, that Joseph might have had some weird superhuman ability, which is really weird to think about. But he's like, I don't know why all these people thought they saw him levitate and all this stuff. It's hard to explain. And the best explanation that skeptics have given is that he was a gymnast who could just jump really high, but people point out that's not consistent at all with the accounts and a bunch of different reasons. So yeah, it's one of those things where it's like, that's really weird. Maybe we can say we don't know. Maybe we can say it was God, but sometimes it didn't happen in religious context. So I don't know, but I kind of agree with Allison where he says it's kind of weird for me to think that God would just routinely just pick him up and float him. Does he just get bored? Like, I don't know. So yeah, I think there's some.
I feel like something like that. If like, let's say, God wants everyone to know him, right? And maybe a really good way, and I know we've talked about this, Brian, like a really good way, potentially, to get that message out would be like, hey, here's this guy who can just levitate, like just like I'm speaking for God, here's me levitating, right? Like that's if God wants everyone to know him, wouldn't that be an easy way to just kind of get that message out there? Or you think that would not be?
It would. I mean, again, this is where it gets into the difficulty of divine psychology. Is do we think God, if God just wants people to know him, then he could just carve in the moon, Yahweh was here or Jesus saves or something. Like there's obviously ways God could do it where it's more obvious, but I don't even know if that's his intention, right? Maybe God doesn't want to do it because people who would not want to be in a relationship regardless would reject him, and they wouldn't have free will because now God would be standing over him. And if they know God exists, then they can't go and sin anymore freely, or they feel whatever the reason. I'm not saying that's the actual reason. Maybe people would blame God for suffering if that was the case, then if they knew he existed. So maybe there's good reasons God has for being hidden and for letting us to figure things out for ourselves, which is why miracles are so rare, right? Like sometimes in key moments in history, like the resurrection of Jesus to establish a church or to become God incarnate, you do have things like that. But for the most part, these things are pretty rare. And I think they're rare for that reason, where if these things were really common, we'd kind of get bored of them and we'd be used to it. And God would be just as obvious as trees. And we wouldn't really be searching like and debating like we are right now. We'd be like, yeah, God exists. Everyone knows that. So what? I think the whole point of us having to search these things and to research them is what makes us passionate about it and what makes us want to do that. So that's just how I see it. But I think that there are reasons to think that God wouldn't want to be as explicitly obvious, but at the same time, I think it's enough where it's justified to believe that he exists. So it's a Goldilocks zone. You don't want too much on either side. If he never did miracles, that'd be good evidence he didn't exist. But if he always did it, then we would know he existed, but that might make a different relationship. So I don't know. I think it just, there's a middle ground.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, that kind of gets into the whole divine hiddenness thing, which we don't want to get into today.
Yeah, could be a whole other stream.
Yeah. I mean, we could always ask the question, like, what, I don't mean to bring this out too long, but like, what is, if there were to be a God, a theistic God existing in our world, interacting with our plane of existence, what would be the probability, how's the best way to say this? Like the probability of having few miracles and rarely happening, like what would be the probability of that being the case given a theistic God who interacts with our plane of existence?
Yeah, that's a fair question.
Like, if there were a theistic God, wouldn't we expect more interaction? And I know that's more divine hiddenness, so you don't have to.
But and it goes both ways, right? If there wasn't a theistic God, would we expect there to be any miracle claims? Now, maybe I think both of us would say, yeah, there'd be claims of them because you could have people mistaking things and thinking Thor causes lightning or something.
Sure.
But would we have the kinds of evidence that we do have? And I think the reason I threw out the numbers is not to say that, I have to defend every miracle. I don't defend lots of miracle claims. I think there's lots of ones in Pentecostal circles that I would say just placebo effects, people who don't feel pain after arthritis or something. But, when you have hundreds of millions of witnesses that I actually wanted to do a calculation on this sometime, but it's like, let's just take that 200 million number. That's actually lower because it's only Pentecostals, but let's just do that to be generous. And let's say that 99.5% of those are either easily, like they're just misdiagnosed or they're just misperceived or people are lying or something like that. So let's say that 90. So let's just take 0.5% of those claims. So that's still a million claims. And let's say that these are, and so of that 0.5%, we're talking about things that are firsthand, that they're not second or third hand removed, that are very visual things like limbs growing back or wounds closing or people who are morbidly obese instantly getting skinny or something like that. Things that would be really hard to be mistaken about. That's like pretty obvious. Like you couldn't really misdiagnose it realistically, or like a bone sticking out that instantly goes in. Out of those, if each of those people are like generally reliable, as far as we know, they have like a 95% chance of telling the truth and being sincere. Given that, what's the probability that miracles that all of those are false? And I would say that it seems pretty low that every single one of those claims would be false, given those probabilities. So I guess when you have so many claims, it's like, what's the probability that all of them are wrong? I feel like it's pretty low, which is why it's a burden of just saying all we need is one technically, although I think we have a lot more than one. So I don't know. That's how I see it.
Yeah. I guess it's the claim would be false in what way? So, right. So I would agree with you as far as like, I'm sure some of those are like something happened there. Mm-hmm. Is it tied to a supernatural existence? That's more of the issue in my mind. I don't know, but
yeah, and that's why we would need criteria, right, to establish what would we predict a supernatural one versus a natural one. So that's why I tried to argue that at the beginning. I know that's the hardest part. I agree. I think that's the gap problem between how do we get from we don't know to God did it. And I would say that in science, it's how we typically do. We make hypotheses based on phenomenon. We say we don't know yet, but here's what I propose. Here's the qualities. Like, for example, the Higgs boson, we predicted based on the math, and then we found it, I think, in 2011, 2012. But before that, we didn't actually know it existed. We just said, well, it probably exists based on this, and we were right. Or like dark energy, dark matter. I don't think we've actually observed it, but that's a prediction based on the expansion rate of the universe and stuff. So I think when we observe things, we make predictions and say, well, here's the properties this must have. And then we wait to see if we discover it or not, or falsify it and show that it's not right. So I don't think in science we generally just say we don't know, let's not bother looking into it, right? No, you could see an apple fall from a tree and say, well, it just does, or you could say, well, no, maybe it's gravity, and maybe the gravity has this pull of rate, and we can do all that stuff. So it just depends on what it is. So I guess just saying I don't know is not itself an explanation. We can try to look for one, and we can say that we don't know yet, but I think we need to at least formulate some hypothesis. I don't think it's scientific just to sit back and not even give a proposed explanation, right? So that's just what I would say.
Sure. Well, I don't have any further questions, so thanks again for joining us.
Yeah,
thank you for having me. I appreciate it, guys.
That was a great time.
Yep.
All right, man. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.